So hello and welcome to this panel, Disarming Disinformation, how leading international editors are responding to information pollution in a pivotal year for democracy. I'm Julie Posetti. I'm Global Director of Research at ICFJ, the International Centre for Journalists, and Professor of Journalism at City University of London. And this panel, this esteemed panel, presents today the first findings from ICFJ's new global research project, which is called Disarming Disinformation. And that involves researchers from ICFJ being embedded in multiple international newsrooms in 5 countries to study their responses to information pollution in the context of looming elections. So 2024 is recognised as a pivotal year for democracy in dozens of countries, from the United States to South Africa, and the function of independent journalism in securing and popularising facts, as well as scrutinising elections, remains essential. But it's this democratic function that also exposes journalists and their news organisations to increased attacks on their safety, their sustainability, and their freedom, especially during election periods. And today we're joined by editorial leaders from 4 of the outlets that we're studying. To my left, Nobel Laureate Maria Ressa, who is the CEO of Rappler in the Philippines. On my far right, not politically necessarily, but situationally, we have Natalia Antalava, the founder of Koda Story, and also Branko Brkic. Every single time I say your name in public, I get it wrong. I'm sorry, Branko. From South Africa's daily Maverick, and to my left, Patricia Campos Melo from Brazil's Folha de Sao Paulo. So these incredible journalists and editors are leading newsrooms or working as editors at large, in the case of Patricia, in outlets which have experienced some of the most significant attacks on journalists within them that we've seen over the past decade. And the purpose of this discussion is to bring to the surface some of the work that they have done in terms of countering disinformation and narrative capture from an editorial perspective, but also trying to understand how this has shifted in the age of AI, again in the context of elections. So let's start with you, Maria. At the end of 2021, you won the Nobel Peace Prize, which recognised your investigations into digital disinformation networks and acknowledged the function of independent journalism in the Philippines in trying to secure democracy. And a year later, generative AI went mainstream. And I remember sitting on a panel with you in Oslo, I think, to mark the first anniversary after you were awarded the Nobel Prize, and you said, in 2024, democracy could fall off a cliff. So how has the disinformation landscape changed since you won the Nobel Prize, and how have you adapted editorial responses, particularly within the Philippines context, since then?
So first, it's been 8 years since we've come under attack in the Philippines. So in 2016 was when the exponential attacks on social media came at us. I think we all have that in common on the panel. How cool is it to be here together? The quick answer to your question, Julie, is that it got significantly worse, and it will get significantly worse this year, right? As critical countries, India, EU, Indonesia already went to elections in February, but of course the United States in November. We already can't tell fact from fiction because the first generation of AI in social media didn't actually anchor on facts and spread lies, fear, anger, hate in 2018 6 times faster than facts. And now the new large language models are probabilistic machines. They are not anchored in facts. So we're going to do this again. But let me pull out, right? Like, I don't think you believed me in 2016 when I said that what was happening to us is coming for you. It did come for you, sadly, I'm sorry. Please know it can get better. So in 2016, we had the exponential attacks online. In 2017, the court cases began. Keelan Gallagher, who is a co-lead of our international council, is here working really around the clock. I'm not in jail, right? After facing almost 100 years in jail, I think.
You're not in jail, but thank you. All of the applause is warranted. You're not in jail, but our research and others' advocacy has highlighted how the online environment in which you were operating really was part of the enabling context for your persecution and then prosecution. And many people are not aware that you are still facing jail time. This hasn't all gone away, has it?
My lawyers keep track of how many years. I try to forget about it. But so let me quickly answer your question. What has it done to our news organization, right? It's that Nietzsche quote, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. It's very hard to use that word today, kill, because there is so much violence. This is my 38th year as a journalist, and I've never lived through anything like this. And part of the reason there is so much violence and war is because these platforms that connect us literally reward violence. And online violence is real-world violence. So the two things that happened, my news organization, when my government first tried to shut us down in 2018, in January, within 4 months, we dropped 49% of our advertising revenue. But right after that, I talked to my team, just like this. I have a very young team, and I asked them, the median age is 23 years old. And I told our reporters that if you want, this is a different time, we can try to place you. We will place you in another news organization. I felt confident in saying that because they're great folks, right? Not one journalist took that. And if anything, from 2016 all the way through until today, our journalists, our mission became crystal clear. And because the mission was crystal clear, we were forced to pivot. We were forced to, I hate it when big tech says innovate, because we do it with standards and ethics. They do it with relative impunity, right? So, sorry, let me not go there. I'll just end with this. In that time period from 2016 to today, in those 8 years, I went from believing in the transformative powers of technology. I was hoping it could jumpstart development in my country, to now realizing that we need to stop the impunity. The laws in the real physical world must be the laws in the virtual world. And I've given up. We are building tech for the public sphere. And that is the challenge to every journalist here, right? We do not have to accept this corrosive, corrupted public information ecosystem.
And so just to kind of highlight that point, what you're saying is your response now, even in the context of generative AI, is to develop editorially led tech that has kind of a human rights core, essentially.
She said it better than I did.
No, I did not.
No, but like quickly, because I know I want you to hear from my co-panelists because they're all incredible. I think one is we went to something called the Matrix Protocol. Google this, but the Matrix Protocol, we built a chat app connected to our news organization. The Matrix Protocol is end-to-end encrypted. You can actually move. You will not be insidiously manipulated. It is interoperable and something that can connect all of us online. But the other part, the news organization itself, we had to change ourselves from beats, which is the way news organizations are pulled, into topics, which is the way the internet, the way you search, right? And we did, in these topics, they become subject matter experts. And our team, the journalists, actually feed the machine, train the machine on the back end with the topics that you will see fed through our site. So you adapt to the machine, but you make sure you rule the machine.
And my colleague Nabila Shabir and I spent a couple of weeks embedded with Rappler in September watching the way this was evolving, and it was fascinating to see. Natalia, I want to come to you next. So Koda Story began, I think, in 2016, if I remember correctly.
2016, 17, yeah.
Yep, and it started with an investigation into the function of Russian disinformation narratives connected to the queer community. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. And the reason we picked that story, the story of the LGBTQ in Russia, was because by then the mainstream media in the West has established very well that Russia was a terrible place to be a gay man or woman. But no one had explained why. So we really were trying to figure out what's the food, because Koda is really all about digging into the roots of global crises and identifying patterns. I think so much of the response to disinformation has been fact-checking, and obviously fact-checking, I mean, we shouldn't even have to say it. We just need to, that just has to be part of everyday work, right? But once you're fact-checking something and putting it out, you're basically being reactive. You're on the defensive. So what we try to do is really proactive kind of journalism, where we try to identify stories and kind of see the butterfly effect of the one thing that pops up in one place and then, comes out in another. And the gay rights was one of these stories. Another story that's very striking is a while ago we started covering, we started with Russia, a law on foreign agents. It was a story that most of the media ignored at the time, but it was clearly a very important tool for the Kremlin for silencing dissent. And it was very much a prelude to the war in Ukraine. And we watched how the same law, if you look at how the authoritarian playbook is just adopted by these, across the world. We watched how this law was then, adopted in Nicaragua, then it was adopted in Belarus, then Egypt, Poland and Hungary. And it's amazing to sit here today while the country that I'm from, in Georgia, there are thousands, tens of thousands of protesters out in the streets. Today, protesting adoption of the same law in Georgia, which is just the most extraordinary retreat into autocracy for a country that was once a beacon of democracy in the region. So I think following these patterns and trying to identify the root causes, and one of these root causes, without any doubt, is what Maria just talked about, are the tech platforms and the way that authoritarian regimes across the world use the tech platforms to push their own agendas, but also the way that how the platforms themselves are turning our societies, even the democratic societies, into more authoritarian societies. And it's a scary thing to watch. And I'll wrap up, someone was just telling me, for the first time recently, here in Perugia, I heard the concept, and I haven't read the book yet, so I can't recommend it, of former Harvard professor, of collective illusions, that basically our brain is hardwired to believe the loudest voice that is repeated, that repeats itself the most. And the business platform of the big tech is all around repeating and amplifying the loudest voices. So no wonder that we find ourselves in this mess.
And so Koda Story is interesting because you kind of built the organization from a Tbilisi base, so within Georgia, where you've said you're from. Georgia is, of course, facing elections, along with Brazil and South Africa and other countries that we're studying. And I am interested particularly in the ways in which you've tried to bring accountability reporting to what you sometimes refer to as tech authoritarianism, and also the ways in which you're investigating narrative capture. And spending time with you, as we did in June last year with your Koda colleagues, one of the things that struck me is what you had identified as the kind of weaponization of nostalgia, and how that was being used to co-opt public discourse and to influence voters in terms of the Kremlin line. So can you tell us perhaps how, at this stage, considering the elections there, but also globally, since you have a kind of global-facing remit, where the kinds of disinformation narratives you're encountering now, and the ways in which you're trying to respond to those, if there's anything different that you're doing, particularly in the context of the threats posed by generative AI.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up nostalgia, because I think, and I think it once again underlines the fact that the authoritarian playbook, they learn from each other really well. They're very effective at working together and identifying very local grievances, but applying kind of the same tools. And librarians face attacks now from the United States to the countries in Africa. Like, it's the same patterns that are playing out all across the world. I think, information ecosystem that we live in is just such a huge part of it. And AI is just putting the disinformation that already exists, and that making the shouting match that we're all in, and trying to break through to get the good information out there that is being drowned out by everything else that's being put out on the platforms. And AI is just going to make it much, much worse. It's just going to be the same thing, but on steroids and with a lot less control. And I think one last thing is, I think weaponization of something like weaponization of nostalgia is a really good example of creating realities that, offering people alternative realities that they want to live in if they want to choose. And essentially that's what authoritarian governments do that, and the platforms do that as well. And the price for that is that we lose our shared reality, and without it, journalism can't really survive.
Yeah, it's like the alternative facts narrative coming out of the former Trump White House. Branko, South Africa is celebrating 30 years of democracy this year. You have elections at the end of May, and you're the editor-in-chief of what I often hear referred to as one of the last independent newsrooms left standing in South Africa, which is kind of shocking to consider, given the way in which the rest of the world was inspired by South Africa throwing off the shackles of authoritarianism. If you could please share with us, and we have not spent time with you yet, we're going to be in Daily Maverick's newsrooms for the 2 weeks before the elections, looking at what you're doing up close. But can you share with us at this point how you're planning for coverage and how you are in fact conducting coverage now, mindful of the kinds of threats associated with the sorts of narrative capture and disinformation that we've been talking about?
I think it's very important to understand that we always have to face the choice of what are we going to cover. It's really crucial because, needless to say, with the resources we have, and Daily Maverick is one of the, I think it's the second biggest editorial room in the country, but we still could have 3 or 4 times more journalists and still know what to do with them every day. So the problem we have right now is what to act and which threats are real, which threats are just verbal. And I'll give you an example of what happened, which gave us a pretty interesting, how could I say, outlook. We had something that people call the stunt, something called advertising. Let's call it a stunt again. On Monday, we switched Daily Maverick for 24 hours in order to highlight to our readers and South Africa what would their own world will look like without a good newspaper. Interesting reaction happened on social media, especially Twitter, which we decided to monitor. Literally every single network, online network, got activated in order to wish us a good riddance and wish us to stay shut forever. Funny enough is that the only networks that bother me are the networks that actually have some kind of a ability to jump from the virtual world to the real world. And one of the networks that really worries me is the xenophobic violence network. So let me just give you a bit of background about it. in 2020, in March, the world locks down, and in a country as poor as South Africa, the biggest problem was felt amongst the poorest of the poor, and which we're talking about 70% of the population. In townships, there was an acute shortage of food and acute shortage of just about everything else. And the worst of them all were foreigners, the foreign workers, and especially the refugees from Zimbabwe. Less than 2 months after the lockdown started, the online disinformation campaign that pointing out that this is all problem because the Zimbabweans started, and it was one of those worst and most effective xenophobic campaigns I've ever seen. Within 2 months, we busted. We published a big expose about who these people are, what they're doing, why they're doing. And that's where my problem is. So you would say that in a normal world, journalism done, we've done our job. Mm-hmm. The rest of them, the authorities should take over. And you would expect that 30 years in democracy, so in those days, 26 years in democracy, 27, the government, the ANC government would do the right thing, swoop into action and bust the network. Do you know what the ANC government did?
I'm sure you're about to tell us. I don't know that I want to know.
They made a very strong swing towards populism and xenophobia. Because turns out the xenophobic parties in local elections that happened the following years made a big local success. Opposition parties decided to, not everybody, but almost every other opposition party decided to swing towards xenophobia. And then we have premiers in South African provinces that are openly xenophobic. So that worries me. I'm not worried about people shouting on Twitter and Facebook, just too many of them. And if we react to them, we're always in a back foot. We react to somebody's fancy. We waste our precious resources to respond to people who have nothing better to do. What I'm worried about is that with actual action online turns into action in the real world. And yeah. that is the worry right now.
And so just for those of you who haven't seen it, it's worth having a look at what Daily Maverick did on Monday this week, wasn't it? So I got the email alert, Daily Maverick has shut down, which of course immediately made me open the bit of clickbait, but very effective clickbait, made me open the newsletter. And
sorry, the woman who actually was a brainchild is sitting here. Her name is Fran Bayton. He's amongst us, and she's the genius behind it.
Hi, Fran. It really, it was evocative because you're trying to mobilize a community in South Africa that is aware that critical independent journalism played a vital role in overthrowing apartheid, right? And so the way they posed the question to the audience was essentially, are you prepared for a South Africa where there is an absence of...
Is this what you want?
Yes, so where you wake up to a blank page where there should be accountability reporting in a context of increasing corruption and a resurgence of xenophobia and racist hate speech, for example. But you've also, and you've alluded to this just now, overseen a newsroom in the context of some of those physical realm consequences of the kind of malign actors who are using social media and the companies who failed to respond to the manipulation of their platforms to target journalists, particularly the women journalists in your newsroom. And so gendered disinformation has been a big part of this, hasn't it?
Yep.
So how are you trying to, recognizing that in the context of an election, those sorts of attacks will increase and the risks associated with them, which have resulted in you at times having to physically move journalists from safe house to safe house. How are you trying to prepare for that?
Look, our job, and I told you a few hours ago, our job is actually to protect our journalists. Again, my job is not to, I don't feel my responsibility is that to police Twitter, because that should be Twitter's job. it's their platform. Our job is to protect our journalists, and we actually do a lot. I mean, we actually did a documentary about attacks on our female journalists, and some of them actually jumped from, again, from online world into real world. One of our journalists' house was broken into by the crime intelligence, by the police, actually. They stole her laptop. Look, some of our journalists, just to give you an idea, 60% of Delhi Maverick is female, by the way. And some of our journalists, we literally have to physically relocate after our exposés, actually before the exposés. So
physically they were?
We have to put them, we have to actually put them to 2 or 3 weeks away.
Right.
In the safe houses, in the safe spaces, because one of them was exposing the extremely violent populist opposition party. The other one was exposing gangsters. And I'm talking gangsters of Cape Flats in Cape Town, which is some of the most violent criminal gangs that you can ever think of. And, we do whatever we need to do, and I was actually very carefully watching what the Signal is doing. We basically do what the Signal is doing for our journalists and for whistleblowers, including, and just to give you an idea, when we started, when the coronavirus lockdown started, my business partner, Steely, suggested, and we started with that, is that we employed the counseling services. We have a counselor literally on call 24 hours a day, and that 60% of our staff used it in the last 4 years, just to give you an idea of the intensity of the pressure.
Thanks, Branko. So I'm going to turn to you now, Patricia. I mean, it's a matter of public record that as an investigative reporter, particularly an investigative reporter covering disinformation under Bolsonaro's rule in Brazil, that you were also targeted. I mean, it's some of the most prolific gendered disinformation I've seen against a working journalist. And many of the people in this room will be aware, and you've spoken on panels I've anchored before about those experiences. But in summary, you ended up going to court to try to get legal redress, including involving a sitting president, which is rather extraordinary. But you continue to report on disinformation, and to do so in the context of another series of elections happening in Brazil, while there is a resurgence of kind of Bolsonarist sentiment. Can you tell us how you're trying to address those challenges, particularly, again, in the context of, the ease and speed with which, and the sort of low-cost barriers to disinformation content generation that we now are living with? Sure.
Brazil has just emerged from a coup attempt on January 8th, 2023. It was very similar to what happened in the US on January 6, 2021. It was sort of a reunion of election denialists trying to change the results or trying to overthrow the government. And this was all enabled by social media and messaging apps. And what we sort of realize is that this is going to be a permanent campaign from now on in several countries. I mean, saying that the elections are fraudulent is just like a preemptive coup, and it's going to be used always. And that means we have to be permanently monitoring and covering disinformation operations. What we are doing, I mean, there's 3 different fronts. On the one hand, we are monitoring these influence operations and trying to track who's funding them with several tools. On the other hand, we're also tracking legislation. There's a separate movement that is the tech companies aggressively lobbying against any kind of tech regulation. In Brazil, they have been very successful. They've managed to block legislation in Congress for several years. That means that this year we have municipal elections. Over 500 cities are going to elect mayors and council persons. And we don't have any kind of regulation towards campaign online in place. What we have is just random judges or Supreme Court judges deciding to censor this or censor that, which is not ideal. And the third front is, are the platforms actually enforcing their own rules, or are their own rules just a PR tool, right? So I think uniting these three fronts in terms of the coverage, that's how we are sort of organizing ourselves in the newsroom. All the while, we are prepared. I mean, ever since 2018, which was the presidential election that led Jair Bolsonaro to the presidency, it's become, unfortunately, part of the job to be targeted by the president and his allies, particularly if you're a female reporter. So that's something we have been learning to deal with this. It's not easy. It's not something you get used to. But we developed some, I don't know, strategies. And yeah, I mean, it's something, it's a permanent coverage operation.
I mean, we shouldn't have to get used to it, right. but you've developed. So, all right, let's talk about some of the strategies, perhaps, that you have developed. And I'd like you to speak a bit more, if you can, about chasing the money behind the disinformation networks and the ways in which you're also using kind of novel forensic reporting techniques to do that.
Right. We partnered with some genius young guys, Brazilians, who developed a dashboard that monitors public WhatsApp groups and Telegram groups and channels. These are public, so it's not anything that, you know, it's against privacy laws. And even though the numbers are anonymized, and what we can do is we can track, using several tools, the topics that are being discussed, and even like transcribing audios and videos. And we can also track funding strategies. Like one of the things we did in one time that they were organizing to go to Brasilia, which is the capital of Brazil, and to, again, ask to, you know, annul the election or throw the government out. This was before the presidential election, is to track the numbers they were using to raise money to get these people to go to Brasilia to dispute election results preemptively and all that kind of stuff. So I think we have to be aware, even though everybody was doing this, we were caught by surprise with the attacks in Brasilia in 2023. So that means we're not doing it enough. We have to do it more, and we have to investigate further, because also when there's no regulation, it increases our duty to be sort of trying to understand these movements and the ones that are inauthentic, coordinated. Because also we know platforms now, X more than ever, they're no longer, you know, trust and safety is not a priority anymore.
To the extent that it's been abandoned or sacked in many cases.
Basically,
right?
yes.
Yep.
They dismantle the trust and safety teams. That means we journalists, we have more work to do, and that's what we intend to do.
So can we probe this a bit further? Because what you're describing is a combination of investigation, and quite novel forms of investigation, chasing the money and using advanced technology to allow you to do that, which is, you know, great from a reporting perspective. You're talking about accountability journalism related to authoritarian tech as well, so that sort of reportage. But you're also discussing a kind of function for journalists and journalism in a context of ongoing and increasing threats to democracy, which sounds a little bit like advocacy for regulation. And I'll put this to the whole panel here, and maybe starting with you, Maria, actually. A lot of resistance still exists within professional journalism to any kind of role that seems somehow about advocacy or activism, right? But what you're describing is a series of attacks on democratic processes and principles, and a necessary function for journalism there. So would you like to address that first?
I just wanted to make one comment.
Yeah.
I do not think, I would not describe this advocacy. And I still think activism is not a function and the role at all. I think we're just showing, you know, when there's aggressive lobbying against regulation and when the platform, this is like straight reporting. If it works for advocacy purposes, that's, you know, not our problem, but yeah.
So you're doing the journalism then, and if it's used for advocacy purposes, so be it, but it's about doing the kind of accountability reporting around the role of legislation and regulation. Maria?
You know, we're old-style journalists. I hate to say old style, because we're not old, right? But, I mean, we're traditional. We grew up at a time when you do the journalism, I think, but our information ecosystem pivoted when big tech took over as the gatekeepers from news organizations. And we can't pretend that that's not the case. When it becomes a battle for facts, journalists are activists. That's as far as I go, right? I mean, in Rappler, we did set up a civic engagement team. So when we set up in 2012, I didn't have any marketing. I didn't set up a marketing arm. I don't spend any money on marketing. We had a civic engagement team because I wanted the impact of journalists. And the investigative reporters are, like us here, investigative reporters. I mean, look, the breaking news out of Georgia right now, right? You have a Putin-style foreign, and it passed, and you have, I don't know, I'm sure she would rather be in the protests, but she's here with us. I mean, she won cases against the two Bolsonaros, and Bronco, I'm sorry, I'm really happy to be on a panel with them. Journalism has gone through a lot. I don't, go.
If I could just add one point, I don't think it's only big tech. There's a problem. We need to understand this old idea about fourth estate. And the reason I'm saying that, I was at the conference and there were a lot of people from a classical sector, let's call it the classical sector, where the TV especially, and they were saying, our job is to give people information and let them make up their minds. And that sounds so beautiful, and I'd love it. I'd love to live in a world where my job is done when a story is filed. I'd love that. But it's not that world anymore. And the problem is that we are fourth estate, but our fourth estateness of the fourth estate depends on the first three estates functioning. The first three estates are not functioning in most of the countries in the world. I mean, we're seeing it in America right now. Trump is testing the legal system of the biggest and most powerful country in the world. Can you imagine South Africa? There's two words, Jacob Zuma in South Africa.
You have elections.
So I'm just saying is that thinking that that the world is changing, but we are staying in 1970, it's really wrong. And I explained to my guys, and my guys will hear it again. If we continue like this, we're going to be exceptionally precisely reporting and dispassionately and fairly reporting from the end of the world. But the idea is that the world not to end. So if those first three estates are failing, we must have a debate. It's only honest and fair to the people whose mandate we took as a fourth estate to have a debate and discussion about what is our role. I'm not saying let's be activists, but at the same time, if others are not functioning, what do we do? And again, it's really easy. It's easy for me to look at the people from state broadcasters, who are functioning, and they say, look, I'm just giving information, because they're funded in a way that they need to be dispassionate and in the center. But the world is not like that anymore. I'm not saying...
I both agree and slightly disagree with you, because I think the rules that we have in place and the kind of the ethics and the structure of journalism...
Nothing changed.
Journalism, and not as an industry, but journalism as an institution of liberalism, they are valid and they are deployable and that we can use them. And the same way I would go out and protest if I was working for a TV station and government took me off air. I have a responsibility to say that you are interfering with my ability to do my job. I believe in women's rights to have an abortion, but I'm not going to join an anti-abortion protest because I need to be able to talk to both sides to do my job. But in this case, it's interfering, the platforms are directly interfering with my ability to do my job. And in that case, I have to defend the profession.
And can I add one thing to that, is they're not only interfering with our jobs, they're literally changing us people, right? The US Surgeon General's report came out May last year that said teenagers, and they did teenagers, but what about us, right? Greater incidence of suicide, of sleeplessness, an epidemic of loneliness. This is global. And then in addition to that, you're talking about VDEM last year said 72% of the world is under authoritarian rule. We're electing them, right?
So, and you see these things as linked.
Yeah.
To bring it back to disinformation again,
absolutely
you see these,
linked.
Yeah. And so if I can summarize what you're saying, is it's time for a reckoning. It's time for a reckoning that recognizes the kinds of challenges and the costs associated with those challenges, which is not to say throwing out ethical journalism practice.
No, quite the opposite. But I think we need to take our heads out of the sand as an industry and recognize that, you know, we are in a really weird relationship with big tech.
Yeah.
And they're not on our side.
Possibly
They've got
an
a business
abusive one.
model. It's working for them. They're making lots of money. Good on them. Our job is the same as it was when we are reporting on oil companies. You know.
But I would say their business model is, to a journalist, unethical, because it is insidious manipulation. You know, advertising, micro-targeting is very, very different from media advertising, where you would all see, like we all, let's change the photo. No, we all see the same photo in front of us, right? But micro-targeting and kind of the recommendation engine can give every person in this room a different photo, a different reality. That would be called an insane asylum, right? If we were living in the real world. So this is different.
Okay, and I mean, we were discussing this at lunch, but I guess one of the fundamental distinctions between the role of journalism in a democratic society and the role that the platforms have carved out for themselves is, I would argue that journalists and news organizations serve audiences in the public interest. I mean, that should be the mission. As far as big tech's concerned, they sell audiences, you know, profit. They sell audiences. Profit is the motivation. And I guess that what you're all saying is that has to be part of the story that you are telling in terms of the accountability of these companies with regard to the toxic information ecosystem. We only have 7 minutes left, so I'm going to go to the floor for questions. Please raise your hand. There'll be microphones coming around to you. And anything that you panelists are keen to say, please say in the context of the questions that come, assuming we have questions.
You guys have seen Elon Musk and
there's
Brazil.
a hand up at the front and there's a hand up towards the back. So if you can stand up and if you are comfortable telling us who you are, please do so.
Hi, my name is Karina Janubla. I'm from Brazil, and my question is for Patricia Campos Melo. Recently we saw Elon Musk criticizing Alexandre de Moraes. So the question is, how do you see Elon Musk meddling in the regulation of digital platforms in Brazil? And how can Brazil create a law if the platform's owners don't respect the authorities?
Thank you for your question. I think I'm not sure if everybody's aware, but there was this huge public fight between Elon Musk and one of the Supreme Court judges in Brazil, who, during the presidential election in 2022, got several accounts removed and content, and this, you know, until today, some of those accounts are blocked. And so Elon Musk was accusing him of censorship. I would just say, we don't have regulation approved by Congress. The main reason is because of the aggressive lobbying of the platforms. And we don't have regulation, so we have judges regulating, which is not ideal, it's not democratic. You want to have legislation discussed in Congress by people elected by the voters. On the other hand, we know that Elon Musk, he accepted orders or removal orders from Narendra Modi in India, from Erdogan in Turkey, and he never complained or said anything. So I guess his indignation is sort of selective, right? So to say, I think the worst case scenario and what we're seeing is if you don't have regulation, there's no vacuum. Something's going to go to that place, you know. So, and one thing about the activism thing, I think one thing that is, I still think that reporters should report, but I do agree with something. The platforms interfere with the distribution of what we do, and that's just, it kills journalism, right? That's really bad. You might be investigating, publishing, but the algorithm is not getting out there, so.
Okay, any other questions? I think there was one down the front here.
Hi. Hey, my name is Cesar Lopez Linares. I work for the Knight Center for Journalism in the Americas in Austin, Texas. But I am personally from Mexico, and Mexico has a big election this year as well. Just recently, the president made a scandal because he revealed personal information from a New York Times reporter, and a campaign of disinformation and attacks online triggered in Twitter. I would like to ask the panelists, what suggestions do you have for these journalists that don't have a big brand behind them to support them, like the New York Times or these big media? And because these situations are likely to repeat this year in Mexico. So what would you advise to them from the emotional, mental health side? Because most of these journalists, even some of the panelists, have suffered this before and have talked about the impact in mental health of these situations, these attacks.
Can I start with you on that one, Maria? Because you have both led a newsroom that was under attack. I mean, it was a smaller, independent newsroom in the global south. It's not quite the same as being an independent journalist or a freelance journalist, where the attacks, when mounted at scale on an individual, we have to acknowledge, horrific, and trying to get any accountability from the platforms or the authorities, and particularly in a country like Mexico, where the physical risks are so huge to journalists. But what would you advise in that situation, Maria?
Macro, micro. The first is news heads here. Collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. We are on the side of facts, and facts are under attack, right? Why is it that the creative industry, the Writers Guild Association, went on a strike together against LLM? So that's at a macro level. We're still living in the old world to some degree, looking at it as different news outlets alone or different countries alone. This is a global problem, and it is both a news organizational problem as well as an individual journalist. We were small in the Philippines. I'd say 1/10 of the size of the largest news group that I'd managed. And what we did was, first, it was early 2016, so we literally had to ask the DART Center to come train they weren't psychologists, but people who can help our team, we're about 100 people, process the attacks. Never do this alone. If you don't have an association, create one, because you're not alone. And you will need support. And then you have other organizations who are all here in Perugia who can help with this. Holding power to account is dangerous, especially in countries like ours. Yours a little worse than mine right now. So you're not alone. Don't act like you're alone. Look for the best practices. We've certainly gone through this. Women are attacked disproportionately more than men, and it is meant to hammer you down, to stop your voice. You keep going.
And the way that disinformation is used as a weapon against journalists, with attacks on their credibility. I mean, we've found this through other research that we've done over the past 5 years, focused on cases of journalists and outlets being targeted. You all represent cases which we have, or associated with cases which we have examined. So we have to be aware that disinformation, targeted disinformation, particularly gendered disinformation, is used as a weapon to attack credible journalism, especially in the context of elections, when the main objective of nefarious actors is to befuddle voters so much that they don't know what to believe, and so they believe nothing. And this makes them exceptionally malleable, including to extraterritorial attacks. So that would be my 10 cents, and we're very much out of time. So let me thank the panelists here for gathering in person in incredibly tumultuous times, both in journalism and democracy. And please stay tuned to ICFJ for updates from this project as the year evolves. And thank you for trekking to the bottom of this extraordinary village to be with us today. Thanks very much.